The physical destruction of a custom solid mahogany front door doesn't sound like a heavy knock. It sounds like a localized bomb detonating directly inside your foyer. It was 5:14 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning in late November. I was asleep in my master bedroom on the second floor. The violent concussive impact of a heavy 40-pound steel police battering ram striking the reinforced deadbolt vibrated straight up through the architectural floorboards. Where the heavy wooden frame splintered instantly, the solid brass hinges tearing cleanly out of the pulverized drywall with a deafening, catastrophic crack. I didn't scream. My eyes snapped open in the pitch black of my bedroom. Before my bare feet could even touch the hardwood floor, the heavy, chaotic thud of tactical combat boots was already storming up the carpeted staircase. The air in the hallway was suddenly thick with the suffocating smell of the aerosolized plaster dust and the freezing outside air rushing rapidly into the house. "Police! Search warrant! Get on the ground! Show me your hands!" The aggressive, overlapping commands roared through the narrow hallway, specifically designed to overwhelm and paralyze anyone inside the structure. A fraction of a second later, the heavy oak door to my master bedroom was kicked completely open. Rebounding violently against the drywall, I was instantly blinded. Harsh, intersecting beams of 4 high-powered, weapon-mounted tactical flashlights cut violently through the darkness, entirely washing out my vision. The sheer intensity of the strobing white LED light turned the room into a chaotic, disorienting nightmare of heavy shadows. Distinct, terrifying red laser dots danced erratically across the center of my chest and the padded headboard directly behind me. And I work as a chief commercial title auditor for a multinational real estate underwriter. I spend my days analyzing complex municipal zoning laws, auditing fraudulent escrows, and tracking forged notary stamps for commercial banks. But right now, none of my corporate credentials mattered. I was standing in the dark, wearing standard gray cotton pajamas, facing heavily armed police officers who had just breached my home with zero hesitation. I know the brutal statistics of tactical police entries, and I know exactly how fast a panicked movement, a defensive shout, or a sudden reach for a cell phone on a nightstand can escalate into a lethal tragedy. When multiple armed officers breach a residence under the absolute belief that they are confronting a hostile, violent suspect, the absolute worst thing you can do is argue or demand to see a warrant. I became completely mechanical. I didn't speak a single word of protest. I slowly raised both of my empty hands high into the air, while I was keeping my fingers spread wide and my palms facing the blinding light. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and immediately dropped my bare knees onto the cold hardwood floor. I interlocked my fingers tightly behind my head and pressed my forehead directly against the baseboards. I kept my breathing slow, shallow, and deliberate. "My hands are empty and visible," I stated loudly, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of panic, projecting clearly over the heavy shouting. "I am unarmed. There is nobody else in the residence. I am complying." The absolute immediate lack of resistance caught the entry team slightly off guard. The shouting dialed back a fraction of a decibel. A heavy, gloved hand gripped the back of my pajama shirt, hauling me up forcefully, while another officer kicked my legs apart to widen my stance. They didn't use standard metal handcuffs. A pair of heavy-duty, thick plastic tactical zip ties were ratcheted aggressively around my wrists, were securing my hands tightly behind my back. The thick plastic dug sharply into my skin, pulling my shoulders into an agonizing, unnatural posture. Another officer rapidly patted down the sides of my pajamas, checking my waistline and ankles for concealed weapons. "Clear the master! Clear the master bath!" the lead officer barked, his heavy encrypted radio crackling loudly on his shoulder strap. "Suspect is secured in the primary bedroom. No weapons visible on her person." "Walk," the officer behind me commanded, grabbing my right bicep and forcefully steering me toward the staircase. I was marched barefoot down the stairs, stepping carefully over massive chunks of splintered mahogany, twisted metal lock casings, and shattered drywall that currently littered my entryway. My solid front door was completely destroyed, hanging awkwardly by a single bent bottom hinge. They didn't stop in the living room. They marched me straight out through the ruined doorway, across the wet concrete of my front porch, and directly onto the cold, damp grass of my front lawn. My quiet suburban cul-de-sac had been transformed into a tactical staging ground. The street was bathed in the rhythmic, flashing red and blue strobe lights of 4 marked county police cruisers parked diagonally across my driveway. The freezing November fog hung low over the manicured lawns, and porch lights from the surrounding houses were flicking on as my neighbors stepped out to watch the quiet, professional woman in the corner house be dragged out in zip ties like a dangerous fugitive. "Hold her here," a deep voice instructed. A heavily built police sergeant with a thick gray buzz cut and a Kevlar tactical vest approached me. He clicked off his blinding flashlight, resting his hand casually on his heavy utility belt. He looked me up and down with an expression of unfiltered, high bureaucratic disgust reserved entirely for violent criminals. "Evelyn Vance?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had dealt with hostile evictions all night. "Yes, Sergeant," I replied calmly, shivering slightly in the freezing air, the plastic zip ties biting deeper into my wrists. "That is my name. I am the sole registered owner of this property." "No, you aren't," a loud, obnoxiously cheerful voice called out from the edge of the driveway. I turned my head. Parked horizontally across the base of my driveway, entirely blocking the police cruisers, was a massive 24-foot commercial U-Haul moving truck. The heavy diesel engine was idling loudly in the quiet neighborhood, its headlights cutting through the fog. Standing on the damp sidewalk directly next to the open cab of the moving truck was my 26-year-old brother, Chase. He was wearing an expensive tailored winter coat, casually holding a steaming, branded cardboard coffee cup. Standing right next to him was our mother, Eleanor, wrapped tightly in a thick cashmere scarf. They weren't panicking. They weren't shocked by the massive police presence or the complete physical destruction of my front door. Chase was looking directly at me, shivering in zip ties on my own lawn with a wide, arrogant, untouchable smirk plastered across his face. Our mother took a slow sip of her coffee, looking at my destroyed front entryway with an expression of mild inconvenience, as if she were inspecting a slightly delayed, messy home renovation. "Morning, Evelyn," Chase called out, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He took a casual step forward, pulling a thick, folded piece of heavy legal parchment from his inner coat pocket. He waved it in the air like a winning lottery ticket. "I told you to be out by the 1st of the month. You didn't listen." I stared at him. Where the pieces of the tactical breach rapidly fell into place with absolute mathematical precision. My home was fully paid off. I had purchased it out of foreclosure 5 years ago and spent a massive amount of my own capital renovating it. Because there was no active mortgage or bank lien attached to the property, the title was entirely free and clear. In the commercial real estate industry, a free and clear title is the absolute prime target for a specific type of white-collar crime, deed forgery. Chase was a chronic, catastrophic failure. He was currently drowning in consumer debt, facing a severe eviction notice from his luxury downtown apartment and attempting to fund a lavish lifestyle he couldn't afford. 3 weeks ago, he had shown up at my office unannounced, demanding that I simply transfer the deed of my 4-bedroom, paid-off suburban home into his name to help him start his new life, suggesting I could just move into a small rental apartment. When I refused and had corporate security physically escort him out of the lobby, Eleanor had left me 7 unhinged voicemails, screaming that I was destroying the family's future by hoarding a house I didn't need. I assumed it was just their standard toxic entitlement. I didn't realize they were actively plotting a hostile, armed takeover. "Sergeant," Chase said, now adopting a polite, overly respectful tone as he addressed the officer. He handed the folded legal parchment to the sergeant. As I told the 911 dispatcher an hour ago, my name is Chase Vance. I am the legal owner of this property. My sister has been squatting here illegally for months. When I came by this morning to enforce the legal eviction and start moving my furniture in, she barricaded the door, screamed that she had a loaded firearm, and threatened to shoot me through the wood if I tried to enter. The sergeant took the paper, turning on a small pen light attached to his tactical vest to illuminate the heavy black text. "That is why we breached the door, Ms. Vance," the sergeant said, looking up at me with cold, uncompromising authority. "We received a priority call for an armed, barricaded squatter actively threatening the legal property owner with lethal force. You're incredibly lucky my officers didn't shoot you on the stairs." "She's unstable, officer," Eleanor chimed in, stepping up beside Chase and putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. She looked at me with manufactured maternal sorrow. "She has completely lost her mind since she lost her corporate job. We've tried to help her, but she refuses to leave Chase's house. She just needs to be removed." Chase pointed his coffee cup at me. "Can you just throw her in the back of a cruiser so the movers can start unloading my boxes? We have a tight schedule today." He assumed he had found the ultimate legal loophole. He assumed he could just forge a generic transfer document he downloaded off the internet, stamp it with a fake notary seal, and use the police department as his personal, heavily armed eviction service. He thought that by swatting me at 5 in the morning, I would be dragged out in pajamas, or thrown into a jail cell on felony charges, and he could casually move his belongings into my master bedroom by noon. He assumed I would be too traumatized and legally ignorant to fight back against a certified piece of paper. He completely forgot what I do for a living. "Sergeant," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any anger, panic, or hysteria, "may I examine the document my brother just handed you?" The freezing morning fog rolled heavily over the damp grass of my front lawn. My bare feet were completely numb against the cold earth, and the thick plastic zip ties biting tightly into my wrists sent sharp, rhythmic pulses of pain up my forearms. I didn't struggle against the restraints. I didn't yell at my mother or scream at my brother. When you are dealing with an armed tactical police unit that has just breached a structure under the belief that you are a violent threat, and the emotional outbursts are a guaranteed way to end up face down on the concrete with a knee in your spine. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the heavily built police sergeant. "Sergeant," I repeated calmly, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of panic, cutting through the low rumble of the idling U-Haul moving truck. "I am a chief commercial title auditor. I audit municipal property transfers for a living. I am respectfully requesting that you hold the document my brother just handed to you up to the light so I can read it." The sergeant didn't immediately comply. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly under the brim of his tactical helmet. Suspects who have just had their front doors pulverized by a 40-pound steel battering ram usually react with sheer terror, hysterical crying, or violent aggression. They do not typically deliver a polite, mechanically precise request to review legal paperwork while standing barefoot in the mud. The absolute lack of resistance or hostility in my posture created a microscopic crack in the tactical narrative Chase had fed to the 911 dispatcher. The sergeant unclipped a small, high-powered penlight from the chest rig of his Kevlar vest. He stepped slightly closer to me, pinched the top corner of the heavy folded parchment between his gloved fingers, and held it up directly in front of my face. He clicked the penlight on, bathing the dense black text in a harsh, clinical white circle. Chase let out a loud, theatrical sigh from the edge of the driveway. "Sergeant, come on, don't humor her. She's just trying to stall so she doesn't have to go to jail. Read the paper. It's a legally binding quitclaim deed. It has a notary stamp and everything. I want her off my property." I ignored my brother entirely. I kept my breathing slow and shallow against the freezing air, reading the document from top to bottom. It took me exactly 12 seconds to completely dismantle Chase's $500,000 illusion. "Sergeant," I noted, my voice crisp and analytical, projecting clearly over the flashing red and blue strobe lights. "Look at the legal description of the property boundary in the second paragraph. It states the property is located in the County of Los Angeles, State of California." The sergeant's brow furrowed heavily. He moved his flashlight slightly, then illuminating the text. "We are currently standing in Fulton County, Georgia," I stated, delivering the geographical fact with lethal, undeniable clarity. My brother downloaded a generic $29 PDF template off the internet and was too arrogant to read the jurisdictional boilerplate text before he printed it. Chase's face instantly drained of all color. He realized the absolute terrifying magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't just handed a forged document to a bank teller. He had handed it to a heavily armed veteran SWAT sergeant who had just executed a high-risk residential breach based entirely on its validity. Eleanor pulled her thick cashmere scarf tighter around her neck. The manufactured maternal sorrow she had weaponized just 2 minutes ago was rapidly giving way to a rigid, anxious posture. She looked nervously at the tactical officers surrounding us. "She's lying to you, officer," Eleanor interjected, her voice tightening with a sharp edge of panic. "She's just making up legal jargon to confuse you. Look at the red stamp at the bottom. It was notarized." The sergeant shifted the beam of his penlight to the bottom right corner of the document. There was a bright red circular ink stamp bearing the seal of a notary public, accompanied by a messy, illegible signature. "Yes, let's look at the notary stamp," I agreed, leaning slightly forward despite the zip ties. "Sergeant, please run your thumb directly over the red ink." The sergeant paused. And then he looked at me, then looked down at the paper. Slowly, he dragged the thick leather thumb of his tactical glove directly across the circular red seal. "It's smooth," the sergeant noted, his deep voice dropping into a heavy, suspicious register. "It's just flat ink." "Exactly," I said. As of January 2021, the state legislature passed a mandate to combat rampant real estate fraud. A flat ink stamp is no longer legally sufficient to authenticate a property transfer. Every single notary in this county is legally required to use a physical, heavy-duty steel crimper to leave a raised, tactile, embossed seal on the paper. If you run your thumb over a legitimate deed, you feel the physical indentation of the state seal. What my brother handed you is a novelty ink stamp he likely ordered off Amazon for $12. Chase took a slow step backward, the steam rising from his coffee cup, suddenly the only thing moving around him. "And the final, absolute proof of a felony forgery is located at the top right corner of the page," I continued, closing the trap with ruthless mechanical precision. "Sergeant, what is the county instrument tracking number printed on that deed?" The sergeant moved his penlight to the top right corner. The corner was completely blank. "There isn't one," the sergeant replied, the realization of what had actually happened finally clicking into place behind his eyes. "There isn't one," I confirmed, because every legally recorded property deed in this state is assigned a 14-digit, cryptographically secure alphanumeric barcode the absolute second it is physically filed and processed by the county clerk. My brother brought you a downloaded, falsely notarized piece of printer paper that has zero legal standing, and he used it to order an armed tactical breach of my home. "He filed it yesterday," Eleanor shrieked, completely abandoning her polite suburban persona. She stepped aggressively toward the sergeant, pointing a trembling finger at the paper. "I drove him to the courthouse myself. We handed it to the clerk. They told us it would take a few days for the barcode to process. She is a liar." The silence that followed her statement was absolute. I didn't argue. I just looked at the sergeant. The heavy veteran officer slowly lowered the forged document. The aggressive, high adrenaline posture of a SWAT commander evaporated, or replaced entirely by the cold, lethal fury of a law enforcement officer who realizes he has just been manipulated into risking his men's lives on a false 911 call. "You drove him to the courthouse yesterday, ma'am?" the sergeant asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut effortlessly through the freezing fog. "Yes, I did," Eleanor insisted, her voice vibrating with hysterical confidence, completely oblivious to the massive operational error she had just made. "Yet yesterday morning at 9 o'clock. The sergeant slowly reached up and turned off his penlight. "Yesterday was Monday, November 11th, the sergeant stated, his tone flat and uncompromising. Veterans Day, a federal holiday. The county courthouse and the recorder's office were locked and chained closed for the entire long weekend. Nobody filed anything yesterday." Eleanor's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill, and the lie was so catastrophic, so easily disproven by a basic calendar, that her entire suburban illusion collapsed in less than a second. Chase forcefully dropped his expensive coffee cup onto the damp asphalt. The hot liquid splashed violently against his tailored winter coat, but he didn't even flinch. He took a slow, terrified step backward toward the massive diesel U-Haul truck, his eyes darting frantically toward the 4 marked police cruisers blocking the driveway. "Don't move!" the sergeant barked, his voice cracking like a whip. He didn't reach for his radio. He dropped his hand directly onto the heavy grip of his holstered service weapon. 2 of the tactical officers standing near my ruined front door immediately stepped off the porch, physically boxing Chase in against the side of the moving truck. The sergeant turned his full attention back to me. The disgust he had shown me 5 minutes earlier was completely gone, or replaced by strict procedural focus. "Ms. Vance," the sergeant said firmly, "if this document is a forgery, where is the legitimate proof of ownership?" "Sergeant, inside my home office on the ground floor, there is a massive, fireproof biometric steel safe bolted to the foundation," I instructed cleanly, perfectly dictating the evidence recovery. "If you cut these zip ties and escort me inside, I will open it and hand you the original heavy stock warranty deed. It bears the physical, raised embossed steel seal of the municipal court and the original 14-digit instrument barcode. If you run that barcode through the mobile data terminal in your cruiser, it will instantly ping the county database and confirm that no transfer of ownership has occurred on this property in the last 5 years. The sergeant didn't hesitate. He pulled a heavy pair of tactical trauma shears from his Kevlar vest. "Cut the zip ties," the sergeant commanded to the officer standing behind me. Then he lowered his voice, looking directly at my brother and mother shivering in the fog. "And nobody leaves this driveway." The heavy metallic snip of the tactical trauma shears, slicing through the thick plastic zip ties, echoed sharply in the freezing morning fog. My arms dropped instantly. The rush of blood back into my restricted hands was a sharp, burning ache, leaving deep, dark red indentations circling my wrists. And I didn't rub them dramatically or collapse onto the damp grass in a theatrical performance of suburban outrage. I simply adjusted the sleeves of my gray cotton pajamas and nodded once at the officer who had freed me. "Step inside with me, Miss Vance," the sergeant ordered. His tone had shifted entirely from the high adrenaline bark of a SWAT commander, clearing a barricaded structure to the strict procedural focus of a veteran investigator. And he turned to the 2 officers standing near the driveway. "Davies, Reyes, maintain a hard perimeter. If either of the subjects attempts to access the cab of that moving truck or a cellular device, detain them immediately." "Wait, Sergeant!" Chase yelled, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn while casually sipping his coffee was entirely gone, replaced by sudden, unfiltered panic. He took a frantic step toward the police line, and his expensive tailored winter coat scraping against the side of the U-Haul. "You can't let her go back inside. She's going to destroy the evidence. You are violating my civil rights as the property owner." "Step back, sir," Officer Davies commanded. The patrolman instantly dropped his hand onto the grip of his holstered service weapon, physically inserting his armored frame between Chase and my ruined front door. Eleanor grabbed Chase's arm, her hands trembling violently. The crushing realization that her federal holiday lie had completely unraveled the fake deed was suffocating her. "Chase, be quiet. Let them look. We have the notarized paperwork. They have to respect it." I didn't look at them. I turned my back on the freezing fog, my bare feet squelching softly on the wet concrete of the porch, and walked back into my house. The interior of my foyer looked like a localized war zone. The massive, solid mahogany front door was hanging diagonally off a single, violently bent brass hinge. The heavy deadbolt had been ripped entirely out of the splintered wooden frame. Thick white plaster dust hung heavily in the air, coating my dark hardwood floors like a thin layer of dirty snow. The sergeant walked right behind me, his heavy boots crunching loudly over the massive chunks of shattered drywall. He kept his flashlight on, illuminating the dark hallway as we bypassed the debris and turned directly into my ground floor home office. The room was completely untouched by the chaotic breach upstairs. I didn't reach for the light switch. I walked straight to the heavy oak desk spanning the back wall. Bolted deeply into the structural concrete foundation beneath the floorboards was a massive commercial-grade, biometric, fireproof, steel safe. The sergeant stood in the doorway, his flashlight beam fixed securely on my hands, ensuring strict protocol. I didn't rush. I knelt on the cold hardwood floor. Winter pressed my right thumb firmly against the illuminated green optical scanner and waited for the sharp, mechanical click of the heavy steel locking bolts retracting. I pulled the thick, insulated door open, reached inside, and retrieved a thick, heavily reinforced legal envelope sealed with red wax. I stood up, turned around, and handed the envelope directly to the sergeant. "Inside is the active, unencumbered warranty deed for this property," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, to dusty office. It was issued by the Fulton County Recorder's Office 5 years ago when I purchased the property out of foreclosure with a cashier's check. The sergeant didn't speak. He broke the red wax seal with his gloved thumb and slid the heavy parchment out into the harsh, clinical light of his penlight. It was completely different from the generic $29 PDF template Chase had handed him on the lawn. The heavy parchment possessed physical weight. It was watermarked. One of the sergeant immediately moved his thumb down to the bottom right corner of the document. He didn't find smooth, cheap novelty ink. He ran his thumb directly over a massive, raised, tactile, embossed steel seal that had been physically crimped completely through the paper fibers. He moved his flashlight to the top right corner. Printed clearly in bold, indelible black ink was a massive, machine-printed barcode positioned immediately above a distinct 14-digit alphanumeric county instrument tracking number. Scan the barcode with the mobile data terminal attached to your cruiser's dashboard, or call it in, I instructed cleanly. It will immediately pull up the live digital registry file. You will see my name, my verified signature, and the exact date of the transfer. You will also see that absolutely zero secondary quitclaim deeds, transfer documents, or liens have been filed against this property in half a decade. The sergeant didn't argue. He gripped the heavy parchment tightly, unclipped his heavy encrypted radio from his chest rig, and pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Command, Sergeant Miller," he reported, his voice a low mechanical drone of absolute law enforcement authority. "I need an immediate priority verification check on a primary residential property deed. Instrument barcode, Alpha Tango 79442001. A heavy crackle of static echoed from the shoulder mic, cutting through the silence of the dark office. "Copy, Unit 4, the dispatcher's voice replied smoothly. "Searching municipal real estate database now." The silence that followed was agonizingly slow. I remained standing barefoot in my pajamas, the freezing air rushing through the destroyed front door, rapidly chilling the room. Outside, and through the heavy double-pane windows of my office, the flashing red and blue strobe lights rhythmically painted the dense fog. Unit 4, the dispatcher reported, her tone shifting into a rapid, automated cadence. Instrument barcode verified. Sole registered owner is Evelyn Vance. The deed was legally recorded and finalized 60 months ago. There are no active liens, no pending transfers, and 0 recorded quitclaim or eviction filings associated with the parcel in the last 5 years. The title is listed as free and clear. The sergeant didn't reply immediately. He slowly lowered his radio. The harsh lines of exhaustion around his eyes were replaced entirely by the cold, lethal fury of a law enforcement commander who had just been aggressively manipulated into risking his men's lives on a false 911 call. My brother hadn't just forged a signature to steal a house. He had deliberately weaponized a highly trained tactical police unit to execute an armed breach on a completely innocent citizen. He had falsely reported an armed, barricaded suspect specifically to circumvent the civil eviction process and steal a $500,000 property in broad daylight. The legal term for it is swatting. When it involves an armed residential breach, it is a severe, unbailable federal crime. "Understood, dispatch," the sergeant finally replied, and his voice dropping into a dangerous, heavy register. "Cancel the civil eviction order. Escalate the incident to a confirmed swatting event and a Priority 1 felony fraud investigation." He clicked the radio off, carefully sliding the authentic deed back into the envelope and handing it to me with a nod of cold, professional respect. "Ms. Vance," the sergeant said firmly, "you have my profound apologies for the forced entry. So the County Risk Management Fund will fully cover the cost of a commercial door replacement and drywall repairs. I highly advise you to put a heavy coat and some shoes on. But right now, I need you to step back outside with me to formally identify the suspects." "Thank you, Sergeant," I replied evenly. I secured the real deed back inside the fireproof safe, spinning the mechanical dial to lock it shut. When I slid my feet into a pair of heavy winter boots sitting near the closet and pulled a thick wool pea coat off the hanger, wrapping it tightly over my pajamas. We walked back out through the splintered, ruined foyer and stepped onto the damp, cold concrete of my front porch. The scene on the driveway had entirely devolved from a smug, victorious property seizure into an atmosphere of absolute, suffocating terror. Chase was no longer holding his coffee cup. When he was standing rigidly against the cold metal side of the idling U-Haul moving truck, his hands raised awkwardly in the air. The 2 tactical patrol officers who had boxed him in were no longer standing casually on the lawn. They had stepped aggressively forward, their hands resting heavily on their holstered service weapons, their tactical flashlights blinding him. Eleanor had completely shattered. Her thick cashmere scarf hung loosely around her neck as she sobbed violently into her hands, on her shoulders heaving in the freezing fog. They had both heard the heavy radio transmission confirming the legitimate deed echoing from the open windows of the police cruisers. The sergeant walked deliberately down the porch steps, the heavy crunch of his boots echoing loudly. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. The terrifying, high adrenaline volume of the initial tactical breach was entirely replaced by the cold, mechanical efficiency of an arrest. He walked directly up to Chase. He grabbed him forcefully by the shoulder of his expensive tailored winter coat and violently spun him around, slamming him chest first against the ribbed metal side of the moving truck. The heavy thud of the impact echoed sharply. "Hey, wait, what are you doing?" Chase screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic croak of unfiltered panic. He struggled wildly against the cold metal, but the sergeant easily overpowered him, kicking his legs apart to widen his stance. "I'm the owner. I showed you the deed. You read it. She's the one squatting. I'm paying for this truck by the hour. Let me go." The rhythmic metallic clatter of heavy steel handcuffs unspooling from a tactical belt cut sharply through his screaming. The sergeant forcefully grabbed Chase's right wrist, twisting it violently behind his back, and secured the freezing steel cuff tightly around his wrist. The ratcheting click engaging was deafening. The dispatcher verified the legitimate 14-digit instrument barcode physically printed on the actual embossed warranty deed locked inside a biometric safe, Mr. Vance, the sergeant stated cleanly, his voice devoid of any emotion, securing the second cuff and pulling the chain tight. The document you provided is a catastrophic forgery downloaded off the internet and illegally stamped to look like a county record. No, I filed it, Chase wailed, me frantically looking over his shoulder toward our mother. The smug, untouchable smirk he wore just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by the sheer, unfiltered terror of a 26-year-old realizing his life was over. Mom, tell him. You drove me to the courthouse. We filed it together. Tell him. The sergeant hauled Chase backward off the truck, spinning him around to face the flashing red and blue strobe lights. You drove him to the courthouse yesterday morning, Mrs. Vance, the sergeant repeated, his tone entirely flat. He looked directly into my mother's terrified, wide eyes. On Veterans Day, when every single municipal, state, and federal building in the country was locked and completely empty. Eleanor froze completely. The hysterical screaming died instantly in her throat. The realization of her catastrophic, undeniable lie slammed into her with the physical force of a freight train. She had just provided a totally false alibi for a felony forgery directly to a SWAT sergeant. You didn't just forge a deed, son, the sergeant said, his voice dropping to a heavy, dangerous register as he looked at Chase. You utilized the 911 emergency system to falsely report an armed, barricaded hostage situation, specifically to orchestrate a tactical SWAT breach on an innocent homeowner. Or you actively attempted to weaponize a heavily armed police unit to execute a fraudulent eviction. The freezing November fog seemed to crystallize the absolute suffocating terror hanging over my damp driveway. Chase was violently pinned back against the ribbed aluminum side of his massive 24-foot U-Haul truck. His expensive, tailored winter coat was smeared with dark, greasy mud from the exterior paneling, and his hands were ratcheted tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. So the arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn 10 minutes earlier while sipping coffee and watching a tactical police unit pulverize my front door was completely obliterated. The veteran SWAT sergeant stood directly in front of him, entirely immovable, his tactical Kevlar vest shifting slightly as he stared down at the 26-year-old who had just orchestrated an armed, multi-officer residential breach over a downloaded PDF. You called 911 and specifically reported an armed, barricaded squatter making lethal threats, the sergeant repeated, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register that completely overpowered the idling diesel engine of the truck. You intentionally utilized a heavily armed police unit as your personal eviction service based on a catastrophic forgery. That is a Priority 1 federal felony, Mr. Vance. It is called swatting. People die during these operations because of arrogant, sociopathic stunts, exactly like yours. No, wait. Please, Chase shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate sob. The reality of federal prison was rapidly vaporizing his confident property owner persona. He frantically looked over his shoulder at our mother, his eyes wide and pleading. Mom, tell him. Tell him I didn't know the deed was fake. You printed it. You found the template online. You told me it was legally binding. Tell him. Eleanor completely shattered, and the thick cashmere scarf she wore to project maternal authority hung limply around her neck. She stood frozen on the damp concrete of the driveway, staring in absolute horror as her golden child actively attempted to throw her under a federal bus to save his own skin. I didn't, Eleanor stammered, her voice thin, reedy, and vibrating with an unfiltered panic that echoed loudly against the side of the massive truck. She took a slow, terrified step backward toward the flashing red and blue strobe lights of the 4 marked police cruisers blocking the street. I just wanted to help him. He was getting evicted from his luxury apartment. Evelyn has a massive house. She doesn't even need 4 bedrooms. I just found a blank form on the internet. I didn't know it was illegal to sign it for her. The absolute silence that followed her confession was deafening. I stood on my ruined front porch, on my bare feet shoved into heavy winter boots, my hands thrust deep into the pockets of my wool peacoat, watching the total, spectacular self-destruction of my family. She hadn't just admitted to assisting him. She had just formally confessed to actively sourcing the fraudulent document, participating in the forgery of my signature, and conspiring to execute a hostile property takeover in front of 4 sworn police officers on active body cameras. The sergeant slowly turned his head away from Chase and locked his eyes directly onto Eleanor. "You found the form on the internet, ma'am?" the sergeant asked smoothly, his tone entirely devoid of the high adrenaline bark he had used to clear my staircase. He sounded like a predator circling a wounded animal. "And you actively participated in the signing of a generic property transfer document, knowing full well you were not the legal owner. Oh, and then presented it to law enforcement officers as a genuine county record?" Eleanor's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. She realized, a fraction of a second too late, exactly what she had just done. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. "Yes, she did," Chase yelled, desperately twisting his handcuffed wrists against the cold metal of the truck. "She rented this U-Haul. Look at the paperwork on the dashboard. It's in her name. She paid for it. And she told me we could just move my stuff in while Evelyn was asleep and force her out into the street. It was her idea." Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth in absolute horror. Her own son was rapidly unloading every single piece of corroborating evidence directly to the police. "Chase, shut up!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She stepped aggressively toward the truck, her hands trembling violently. "Do not say another word. You are ruining everything. You told me it would work. You said the cops wouldn't question a notarized paper." "Officer Reyes," the sergeant commanded over his shoulder, entirely ignoring their screaming match. He pointed a heavy gloved finger directly at my mother. "Detain her. She is a primary co-conspirator to felony forgery, grand theft real estate, and the false reporting of an emergency." A tactical patrol officer immediately stepped forward from the edge of the lawn. He grabbed Eleanor firmly by the arm, spinning her roughly around. The rhythmic metallic clatter of a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs unspooling from his belt cut sharply through the freezing fog. "No! Wait! You can't arrest me!" Eleanor wailed, struggling violently against the officer's unyielding grip. The harsh, strobing police lights illuminated the absolute terror in her eyes as the cold steel bound her arms behind her back. "I'm a mother. I was just trying to secure a home for my son. Evelyn, tell them to stop. You can't send your own mother to jail over a piece of paper. We are family." I didn't flinch. I didn't step off the porch. I looked directly at her, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. "You didn't forge a piece of paper to secure a home, Eleanor," I stated cleanly, now my voice projecting clearly over the flashing lights and the idling diesel engine. "You forged a primary legal instrument to steal a $500,000 fully paid-off commercial asset, and you deliberately weaponized a heavily armed tactical police unit to execute an armed breach on my bedroom at 5 a.m. to do it." I pulled my cell phone from the pocket of my peacoat. The screen was cracked from being violently thrown onto the floor during the raid, but it still functioned. And I opened my digital commercial insurance portal. The tactical breach you orchestrated entirely destroyed a custom, solid mahogany front door and severely compromised the structural framing of my entryway. I continued, speaking with the mechanical, uncompromising precision of an auditor presenting a final liability ledger. The replacement cost for the door, the commercial deadbolts, and the structural drywall repair is roughly $14,000. I hit the record button on the screen, aiming the camera directly at Chase and Eleanor shivering in handcuffs. "I am currently recording this interaction to append to my corporate insurance claim," I announced. "My insurance carrier will rapidly deploy a forensic adjuster to assess the physical damage to my property. And because you are currently being arrested on felony fraud charges specifically related to the destruction of my home, the insurance company will legally subrogate the entire $14,000 claim directly against your personal assets." Chase let out a low, pathetic groan, his knees buckling slightly against the side of the moving truck. He was already facing severe eviction and massive consumer debt. A sudden, aggressive corporate collection agency pursuing him for $14,000 would completely obliterate any chance he had of ever recovering financially. "You can't do that!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice vibrating with hysterical desperation. "We don't have $14,000. We spent everything we had renting the truck and paying Chase's back rent to keep him out of court. You have a massive salary. Just pay for the door yourself. It's your house." "It is my house," I agreed softly, lowering the phone and locking the screen. "And you broke it, so you are going to pay to fix it." The sergeant didn't interrupt the financial execution, and he simply watched the reality of the situation completely crush the two entitled people standing in the mud. He reached up, keyed his encrypted radio, and stared directly at Chase. "Dispatch, Unit 4 Command," the sergeant reported smoothly. "Cancel the civil response. I need 2 transport cruisers at my location immediately for a priority felony booking. We have 2 suspects in custody for multiple counts of forgery, grand theft, and severe swatting." The radio crackled back instantly. "Copy. Unit 4, transports are en route." The radio transmission confirming the 2 transport cruisers echoed loudly across the freezing, damp front lawn of my house. Chase Andrew Vance, the 26-year-old golden child who had expected to sleep in my master bedroom by noon, slowly slumped forward against the ribbed aluminum side of the idling U-Haul truck. His expensive tailored winter coat dragged through the mud. He squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing audibly into the cold metal paneling. He wasn't crying because he felt remorse for weaponizing a tactical police unit against his own sister. He was crying because the reality of the massive, unbailable federal charges had finally pierced his arrogant suburban bubble. Eleanor completely shattered. She stood frozen on the driveway, the thick cashmere scarf hanging limply around her neck, staring in absolute, unfiltered horror as her hands were ratcheted tightly behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs. And the tactical patrol officer held her firmly by the bicep, completely unbothered by her hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. "Evelyn, please!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic croak that echoed loudly over the flashing red and blue strobe lights. She violently twisted her torso toward my ruined porch, desperately trying to appeal to the family bond she had just attempted to destroy. "I am your mother. Tell them to take these cuffs off. I didn't mean to hurt you. We just thought you were being selfish with your money. Chase is going to lose his apartment today. If he goes to jail, his life is over." I didn't flinch. I stood on the damp concrete of my porch, my hands thrust deep into the pockets of my wool peacoat, and looked at her with absolute technical indifference. Chase's life was over the exact second he handed a forged, downloaded PDF to a SWAT sergeant and falsely reported a barricaded hostage situation. "Eleanor," I stated cleanly, my voice completely steady. "You didn't just borrow my car or steal my mail. You actively attempted to execute a hostile takeover of a $500,000 commercial asset using heavily armed police officers as your personal eviction service. You assumed I would be too traumatized by the door breach to realize you faked a notary stamp." Two marked county transport cruisers pulled aggressively into the cul-de-sac, their tires squealing slightly on the wet asphalt. Then they parked diagonally behind the massive moving truck, their headlights cutting through the dense November fog. "We are family!" Eleanor wailed, her knees buckling slightly as the officer forcefully steered her toward the back door of the first cruiser. "You can't do this to us over a house." "You aren't family anymore, Eleanor," I noted quietly, turning my back on the flashing lights and walking toward the shattered remnants of my mahogany front door. "Then you are just an active insurance liability." The sergeant didn't waste any more time. He forcefully hauled Chase off the side of the U-Haul, spinning him around and marching him directly toward the second transport cruiser. Chase didn't fight back. He dragged his expensive ruined boots across the wet pavement, his head hanging in total, humiliating defeat. The heavy steel doors of the patrol cars slammed shut almost simultaneously, sealing my brother and my mother inside the claustrophobic, pitch-black rear suspect cages. "Ms. Vance," the veteran SWAT sergeant said, walking up to the base of my porch steps. The high adrenaline aggression he had used to clear my staircase an hour ago was entirely gone. He unclipped a business card from his Kevlar vest and handed it to me. "A primary detective from the Real Estate Fraud Division will contact you by noon to collect a formal sworn statement and a digital copy of your authentic deed. And I have already dispatched a county risk management adjuster to your address to process the payout for your doorframe." "Thank you, Sergeant," I replied evenly, sliding the card into my pocket. "For the record," the sergeant added, his voice dropping into a low, heavy register, "in 20 years on the tactical entry team, I have never seen a suspect attempt to swat a family member over a real estate dispute using a fake piece of paper. You are incredibly lucky you remained calm on those stairs. The outcome could have been catastrophic." "I am a commercial title auditor, Sergeant," I said simply. "I calculate risk for a living. Arguing with a loaded rifle is a bad investment." The sergeant nodded once, a gesture of cold, professional respect. He turned, walked back to his cruiser, and climbed behind the heavy steering wheel. Within 2 minutes, the entire tactical convoy aggressively pulled out of the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, with the deafening mechanical wail of their sirens echoing into the freezing dawn as they transported my family directly to the county intake facility. I stood alone in the doorway of my paid-off house, the freezing wind rushing through the pulverized doorframe, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket to dial my corporate insurance carrier. Over the next 8 months, the federal and state legal systems executed a masterclass in bureaucratic destruction against my family. Now, because Chase had deliberately utilized the 911 emergency system to falsely report an armed, barricaded hostage situation, specifically to orchestrate a tactical SWAT breach on an innocent homeowner, the local district attorney immediately transferred his case to the federal level. Swatting is a severe, unbailable federal crime. He was formally indicted by a grand jury for felony swatting, aggravated forgery, and attempted grand theft of real estate. Then he was sentenced to 72 months in a federal penitentiary, completely obliterating his arrogant, entitled lifestyle. Eleanor did not escape the blast radius, because she had formally confessed to the SWAT sergeant on an active police body camera that she had sourced the fraudulent document, paid for the U-Haul truck, and actively conspired to execute the hostile property takeover. She was indicted as a primary co-conspirator. She accepted a brutal plea deal to avoid federal prison time, resulting in 5 years of strict, supervised probation, 3,000 hours of community service, and a massive, unpayable permanent felony record. Their financial ruin was absolute. The corporate insurance carrier representing my property rapidly deployed a forensic adjuster, repaired my custom mahogany door and structural framing, and aggressively subrogated the entire $14,000 claim directly against Eleanor's personal assets. and to satisfy the corporate collection agency and pay for Chase's exorbitant federal defense attorney, my parents were forced to completely liquidate their retirement accounts and sell their own home, moving into a cramped, aging apartment on the outskirts of the city. My real estate title remained entirely unencumbered. The county recorder's office flagged my digital file with a high-security lock to prevent any future fraudulent quitclaim filings. I upgraded my home security system with reinforced steel door frames, exterior biometric scanners, and shatterproof glass. They thought they could use a downloaded $29 PDF template to steal a $500,000 commercial asset. They thought I would simply panic, surrender the property, and absorb the liability to protect my brother's weekend moving schedule. They completely forgot that a chief commercial title auditor doesn't argue with forged documents. Or I just handed the police the original cryptographically secured barcode and let the federal justice system hand them the bill. If your entitled family forged a fake property deed, rented a moving truck, and falsely called a SWAT team to violently evict you from your own paid-off home, would you have handed the police the original authentic document, or would you have just surrendered the house to keep the family peace? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of absolute paper trail justice, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.